Cattlemen across the country are only using antibiotics when an animal is sick or injured. That is it. A lot of times when an animal needs an antibiotic, they're younger. Just like kids, they get a bad respiratory infection at school. They got pink eye because pink eye's going through the class. From 2011 to 2018, we have lost 100,000 farmers and ranchers. 100,000. There's these huge shifts that are happening in agriculture right now too. 70% of the US farmland is supposed to change hands in the next 20 years. For example, my dad is 63 years old. If they don't have someone to come back and take care of this land, these animals, who do you think is gonna buy it? Bill Gates is one of the largest landowners in the state of Nebraska. I think right now, he probably owns like 250,000 acres in the United States.
Today's show with Michaela is brought to you by Bioscience Nutrition. As you can tell, we're talking a lot about the importance of different nutrients that are found only from animals. One of those nutrients that happens to be my favorite is creatine. Creatine, I've been using it since 1999. It's a great ergogenic aid, but it also helps support healthy hydration as well as sports performance. So if you've been supplementing with electrolytes to help stay hydrated during the hot summer months of the summer, you also should consider creatine, because it turns out that creatine helps tug water into cells, and creatine is best absorbed when paired with electrolytes. Various studies in humans find when athletes and people who are recreationally exercising supplement with creatine and electrolytes together, they get a better ergogenic effect and better sports performance, and it might help along with cellular hydration. So over at myoscience.com, there's close to 900 reviews from people just like you who are benefiting from pairing creatine with electrolytes during and after exercise. You can check out those reviews and also save by using the code podcast over at myoscience.com. So let's cut back to it with Michaela. Well, Michaela, good morning. Thank you for coming on the podcast. We've been talking for many months now about recording this conversation. We met in Omaha back in 2019 at Dr. Jamie Seaman's Summit, and I really liked the aspect of ranching that you shared with me, just how much ranchers care about their animals and the lengths that you go to during birthing season and so forth, and having to get up at 2 a.m. to help calves be born. How did you get into ranching?
So I grew up ranching on our family ranch in Nebraska. So I'm technically, I say third generation, but I don't know a time when my family didn't have livestock to some extent. So I grew up ranching, raising cattle with my family and my grandparents. So I don't know anything different.
Amazing. And what aspect of ranching do you think the public doesn't quite understand? I think especially people who are vegetarian or vegan, think about cattle ranchers and people who eat meat in general, maybe there's a lack of appreciation for the well-being of the animals. They might think that these people are all about the money and they just slaughter these animals and don't care about them and pump them full of hormones and antibiotics and all that. But that is far from the truth. As far as the relationships that I've cultivated with ranchers, how would you grapple with this misunderstanding about what the public thinks, generally people who avoid meat consumption, and how life really is for a rancher and the relationship with the animals?
It kind of depends on the person, because I feel like some people are so far removed, they don't understand that there's a difference between dairy breeds and beef cattle production. That, if they see a terrible video of someone mishandling animals, they just assume it's every rancher. So kind of depends on the person for how far they were removed, unfortunately. But one of my main, in regards to people who, especially if they choose to not eat meat from a vegan or vegetarian standpoint, that they think it's inhumane and that we don't care and just that they're mistreated from birth. And that is the farthest thing from the truth, because not only do ranchers, it is about money, but that's not what it's really about for ranching, is because you have to love what you're doing. Otherwise you will not do it. So we care about our animals so much from birth. The amount of love and attention that they get is more than, you and I can really put into words sitting here today, but just the lengths we go to care for them from birth, making sure that they're nursing, they're up, they're dry, making sure that they're healthy, they always have food and water. It's a 24/7 job.
Yeah. Can you share a story? What's the most crazy situation you've been in with a calf extreme weather and the snow. I'm as far as I know, and I don't know very much about birthing cattle, obviously,
Yeah.
but this happens in the late spring, but you can get some, or in the springtime, and you can get some storms and things like that in
Yeah.
Nebraska, and there can be predators, I'm sure coyotes and wolves and things like that. What's a crazy story that comes to mind where you've had to be up all night or help out with a calf?
Well, there's two. So the first time I was 8 years old and I was standing with my grandpa at the time, and he was just reminding me to be quiet because a cow was giving birth. And it was a difficult birth, dystocia. I can't remember why she wasn't dilating correctly. But, anyways, my dad's assisting her giving birth. The calf comes out, it's not breathing. And I watch my dad give it CPR. My dad was an Omaha fireman for 25 years, along with ranching. But he's just giving it CPR. And like, that's the first, I can see it. I can close my eyes and see it. But that was my first, like, wow moment. Like, I knew we cared for him, but that's my, like, I will remember that forever, because that was when I was like, man, like, we will try until we can't try anymore. 2 years ago, our cows were out on corn stalks. So in Nebraska, we have a lot of corn around us, obviously. So we let our cows graze corn stalks. So after harvest, they go and graze the leftover plant material. And we go and check them every day. And this cow gave birth about a month early. So they weren't at the home place yet, miles away. And my dad calls me and he goes, "Get in the Ranger and drive. I will meet you." So I knew there was an emergency. We had a cow give birth. She was 11 years old, so it was up and dry. The calf was. She knew what she was doing, but it was stuck in a ravine. It rolled down a hill and was stuck in grass, and it's cold and there's snow and ice. I mean, just winter weather. We worked for 4 hours in a heated room with heaters on it. It was so hot, my necklace was burning my neck because I had metal on. And we're just taking off all our winter clothes. And I tried, and we were rubbing it with towels and just getting it warm. We tubed it with electrolytes. We gave it a shot, a vitamin B concoction shot, and that calf lived. And we just sold it as a herd bull this past year. So 4 hours of blood, sweat, and tears, and that calf lived. And not only lived, but flourished because of that care the cow gave and that we did. That's life-saving circumstance. I mean, that was just doesn't happen often, but that's just one example.
Wow, that's really impressive. Now, how do you not get emotionally attached to these animals, knowing that some will go on to be slaughtered? Do they have ear tags? Do you refer to them? I mean, do you name them? I've had pigs and we processed them and so forth, and that was pretty challenging because we named them and they were pets, if you will, part of the family. And then we've processed chickens, and my daughter will name them. So there is that emotional attachment. How do you deal with that, Michaela?
So we are a registered herd. So all of our cattle are registered, as in they have a specific number. They're registered with the breed association, and they are named, like it's D and D. I can't remember some of the names. I'm drawing a blank, but it could be D and D Cardinal. Could be a bull, for example. So we of course get attached. I have my favorites, just like you. There's probably some hogs you still cared for them, but it didn't pull at the heartstrings as much when you guys were processing, like your kids with their chickens. It's hard. I have a cow right now who's going to be 15 in January. She's the last animal that I ever showed. So I would show her. I took her to Denver to the stock show and stuff. Like, that's going to be hard, but every living thing's going to die. You and I are going to die. Everything's going to die. My goal in life is for our animals to only have one bad day. And we do our best. We take animals to harvest ourselves. We do sell some, through sale barns, but we try to use places that will harvest them, that we like, we agree with, we know them, and treat them humanely as possible. So that's what I tell myself. At the end of the day, we all have one bad day, and I was put here to make sure that every other day that they have is the best that it can be until that bad day.
I really like that perspective, and I think that's a lot of folks who avoid eating animals of all kinds don't understand that aspect of it is like you said, we are all going to die at some point, and these animals likewise will die, and you're giving them a good life, And so I think that's the hard part about this. If we look at, how animals die in nature, it's
Yes.
arguably much more cruel than how they would die if they're being processed, such as like a cattle. And I think, when you see the viral videos of animal cruelty at the processing plants, in my opinion, it's usually the pigs because they're so smart and are hard to control. And so they do zap them with electric probes and things like that. But with processing of animals, and I don't want to lose too much of our audience, but the processors that you prefer, are they using a captive bolt, or how are these animals put down?
First, you brought up videos online. I encourage anybody, if you see one next time, look at the cars in the background. I would say 80 to 90% of those are overseas. They are not, a lot of those mishandling videos are not in the United States. Just a disclaimer, because I see a lot of those and I'm like, that's not even here, which I'm still not saying is okay. But we have pretty dang high standards in the United States, and they do a very good job. There's always going to be a bad apple, but that's just a little disclaimer. Our butchers that we use locally, so these are local, family owned, small business, federal inspected, they use captive bolt, or one butcher I think also will use, I think, a 22, which is the same bolt size as a captive bolt if they're using one with one of those shells on it.
And so, just for folks that don't understand, that is going to go right into the skull and expire the animal very quickly without a bunch of pain. And I think more importantly, what a lot of people don't understand is, as a rancher, you do not want, and anyone who is part of animal husbandry wants to avoid pre-slaughter stress. And I think this is really interesting. You can Google this and go into Journal of Meat Science and various journals. Pre-slaughter stress actually changes the pH and makes the meats, it fouls up the meat, right? So you don't want your animals to be really stressed in the pre-slaughter, process, right? Can you speak to that?
Yes. So I went to school. I'm an animal science degree, and I took meat science. So I actually slaughtered animals, harvested, what have you. But what they call it in cattle terms, it's called a dark cutter. So they're, like you just said, the pH changes, and I can't remember. It's stress, cortisol, lactic acid. I'm sorry, it's been a while since I brushed up on that. But it'll literally change the meat to look dark. If you are somebody who's familiar with wild game or dark meat like elk or something, like, it can change beef to look more of wild game color than our standard beef pigmentation we're all used to seeing. Now, there are animals that also plays into genetics too. So our animals, we handle them very humanely since birth. Our cattle, when we go out to the pasture, they don't run away. A lot of times they look and see, does she have a treat for us? I mean, are we moving? All those factors play into that as well as handling at the butcher. But a lot of that too is that animal's fight or flight is always ready to kick in regards to how they were raised in genetics beforehand. Just like a person who gets excited very easily, that plays into effect too, I will say, as a disclaimer. But animal handling right before, if people are shouting or using methods that aren't humane, they will stress that animal out and can greatly affect the quality of that meat.
Yeah. So as a rancher, you do not want that, right? Because that will
No.
mean that, people won't buy your meat, or you'll get, sub quality, when you go to harvest, right, you won't make as much money, and it's not good for your business and long term. And so going back to what people are doing in other parts of the world, is this Latin America, or where is there more mishandling of animals?
I'm not sure on that. I wish I could remember or like get a look and see. I can't remember off the top of my head is what I'm saying. But if you look at a lot of these places, they're I've seen some bad videos in Mexico. I've seen some bad videos overseas. Now, I'm not saying that's everyone, but I just feel like countries where they just don't have the animal handling and practices that we do, I feel like they're behind. I feel like they're very behind in how we do it here. But I mean, that's what makes our country great, is our infrastructure and what we are able to do as well. Plus, we do, to a certain extent, without going too far, we value life, human or non, higher than a lot of other countries do as well. So
Yeah, really great points there. You mentioned the qualitative aspects of the beef and the visual aspects. One thing that I think a lot of consumers are looking for, and rightfully so, is was the animal pasture raised and was the animal fed grass? I know there's grass pellets being used, and there's a lot of sort of, I don't want to say industry secrets, but different things going on with regards to grass fed versus pasture raised and organic and antibiotics. So if we can start to talk more about that and maybe address the grass fed versus grain fed and things that we talked about on the phone
Yep.
prior to recording. What's your perspective on that?
So I think before we dive into this, you and I understand like how your steak gets to your plate, but a lot of people don't understand, where their cattle actually even born at. I do have people who think that if a cattle is fed grain, that they assume that calf was born in a pen, which is the furthest thing from the truth. So briefly, and this is me giving a cattle industry, just a very generalized description, but calves are born on family ranches just like ours. So ranches across the country have a calving season, which is when their cows give birth. Usually in the spring or in the fall. Ranchers pick usually one or the other. Those calves are born and they stay on that cow's side for 6 to 8 months. So we calve in the spring. We kick our cows out to pasture in May, the end of May, because that's when our grass is peak growing, like it's healthy and ready for animals to graze it. Those cows and calves right now outside my window, I have cows and calves grazing grass right now. They graze grass until the cows and the calves, until 6 to 8 months old, depending on the rancher. We wean early fall. So weaning is when you separate the cow and the calf. At this time, the calves are only nursing morning and night, just like a toddler when they're 1 year old. If they're breastfeeding, you're really not consuming much milk from your mother at this point. You don't really need it. These calves, on average, can weigh 550 pounds. They're not small. They're almost teenage size, like they're taken off. So when ranchers wean, this is when things get really different because one of the great things about ranching in the United States, everyone does it differently. So some ranchers will sell their calves or keep them. And this is where some calves may go to other cattlemen where they continue to graze them on grass in your southern states because Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, we don't have year-long grass growing seasons. If we keep our cattle out on grass in January, they will starve if there's a lot of snow. And even if there's not snow, that grass has gone dormant and there's not enough nutritional quality to carry them through the year, is what I'm saying. So when those calves are weaned, they may go south, Kansas, Oklahoma, places where there's more grass. May stay at the ranch or maybe go to a feedlot type setting, and they're still fed forage-based diets. And then may enter into the food supply system or be kept as breeding stock, may be finished on grass, may be finished on grain. But I just explained 6 to 8 months of the calf's first life, it was on grass. First, the majority of cattle are. There's this statistic that even grain finished cattle, only 11% of their diet when they're harvested was ever grain. So even though they went that route of being grain finished, it was still primarily grass. So, grass finished cattle in the state of Nebraska, if they're born, raised, and fed here, they're going to be feeding hay, silage. They're going to be in a pen type setting, which isn't a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but, 80 to 90% of the grass finished beef we're importing in the United States is from overseas because we don't have that long a growing season if you look at the state, or excuse me, our country as a whole.
Yeah, because of snow and weather and everything like that.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So, I think many people would want exclusively grass-fed beef because of the perception that if a cattle or if cows were eating any sorts of grain or non-grass or alfalfa, whatever it is, then they must require the use of antibiotics because their gut bacteria is all screwed up. And again, this is just like hearsay. People start talking about things and they believe it to be true. What would you say about that? So during the winter, obviously there's no grass. It's frozen over in many states, north of Nebraska and things like that, where there's a lot of ranchers,
Yep.
even parts of Colorado, right? It
Yes.
gets snowy and everything. So as a rancher, do you need to then apply antibiotic or give these cows antibiotics if they're eating the grass, or are they fine?
Ranchers, cattlemen across the country are only using antibiotics when an animal is sick or injured. That is it. You know, so we have cattle at our place that we're feeding, and I would say maybe 1% or less get an antibiotic. Maybe. There's years where we don't treat cattle when they get to this age. A lot of times when an animal needs an antibiotic, they're younger. Just like kids, you know, they get a bad respiratory infection at school. They got pink eye because pink eye's going through the class. Like, and I'm not trying to compare cattle to humans, but when we're trying to understand the reasons why a person would need antibiotic, it does kind of help for those who are not familiar with it. Think about that. When you're older, you mean, when's the last time you or I had an antibiotic? Like, I can't even remember, but you remember when you were young, you maybe had an ear infection or something. That's the frequency in which ranchers are using antibiotics. I had to get a calf in to treat. It had pink eye. Blade of grass made a lesion in its eye. Flies got into its eye, passed bacteria to it, got pink eye. If I didn't treat it, it would spread. Not only could spread through the herd, that calf could go blind. It took me 1.5 hours to get one calf in to treat it. And I think if we could show the general population how labor intensive it is to treat, they would understand how rare it is, not because we're being lazy, and that's not it. It's because we're only going to do it when they need it. It's hundreds of dollars too when a dose is administered, depending on the antibiotic. So raising a calf in a pen, you know, feeding it in a pen versus feeding it in grass, I personally think your antibiotic chances are pretty similar. But that also goes to animal husbandry, how that calf was raised, if it's healthy, just like humans. So I wouldn't say that it's more because a calf is being fed grain the last couple months of its life. It's everything that happened before that that's going to affect that cattle's metabolic health. It's not going to be those last couple months of before harvest.
Interesting. That's a great point. And isn't there rules and regulations about if an animal, if a cow, you just refer to it as cattle, right? If cattle has received antibiotics prior to harvest, don't they have to have a certain window of time where they can't have any antibiotics administered if it was, say, pink eye or something else anyway?
Yes. Yeah, so there's withdrawal times that have been established. And that's another thing too. Depending on a lot of the antibiotics, we have to get a prescription from our large animal veterinarians from. We can't just go buy this medication. We have to get it through a licensed veterinarian. A lot of times we discuss with them what to give them, how much, and we have withdrawal times. And I recently double checked this information to make sure I was accurate, but your big packing plants across the country, they test for antibiotics in the meat. If say, you know, Mike sold 100 calves and you sold it to so-and-so, and they tested your meat and one of your animals tested positive for having an antibiotic, we call it residual in the meat, you would be fined and there would be serious repercussions. So it's not, there's many checks and balances along the way in regards to giving an antibiotic.
Right. So it might happen in a one-off thing, but it's not a systemic issue. And there's a lot of disincentives to partake in those reckless antibiotic administration. Again, I think this is just something that the public and maybe it's activism from, you know, PETA or vegan groups and so forth will say, well, if you eat meat, it's loaded with antibiotics, and that's part of the reason why it's so unhealthy for you in this. So it's good to know there is a set of checks and balances there. And one question that keeps coming up in my mind, when are calves processed? Like, how old are they, generally speaking? You said your calves at the end of 6-8 months are pushing 500 pounds.
Yeah.
At what point are they processed?
So depends on how they're finished and how hard, we call it pushing them, as in how fast you're trying to get them, depending on if you're feeding them on grain. So you call it finished when you feel like they have a good amount of fat on them, not obese by any means, but I'm just talking like mature, right? Mature in your muscle mass, your skeletal, like the guy in the gym who just looks jacked, like in a way, is what I'm saying. So from Birth to when a person harvests, 16, 18, 20 months of age. That just depends on breed, animal size, and how they're being finished. I think grass finished is closer to 18 to maybe 22 months. I'm not 100% sure. I do know it's longer than grain finished. And the reasoning on that is just because of it takes a little longer to get that finish on them that you can get a little faster with grain versus grass. I want to say that's for beef that's raised for meat. Cows, bulls that are used for breeding purposes, they enter the food supply when their job is done. So that's where you get your dog food, depending on the quality of that older animal, or, and I'm not saying this is bad, but that's that cheap meat you're seeing in the grocery store. That's coming from older animals that may not have that finish on them, like your premium beef that we're raising for meat.
I see. So you can buy there is a differentiation there. I was wondering about the dog food aspect of it. So, if anyone's processed a chicken, the older hens, or even older roosters, the meat's kind of stringy and grainy and doesn't really taste all that good. Is that something like a 7, 8, 10-year-old bull would be something like that? So then is there different plants or processing places for dog food or these older animals?
Yeah, we live close to Omaha, which is good and bad. Sometimes I wish we lived a little further away, but one of the benefits is there is we call them a cow kill plant. They take older animals. So what's great is we have a contact there that we actually call. And when we have some older cows, we don't have to then run them through a sale barn. We can take them direct to this harvesting facility, which I also makes me feel a little better that they can just go straight there. And so they process those older animals. And honestly, I don't know if it's just they're looking at the carcasses once they're hanging and then they, go dog food, ground beef. I'm not sure on that side of it. I just know there's certain plants that do that. And then they divvy up that meat how they see fit, I guess is the best way to answer that.
Yeah. And let's talk about the processing, the post-processing, the bones, the organs, the hide. It seems that every aspect of the animal is used in a way. Where does all that stuff go? Because I work with a local rancher, has a small outfit, under 50 head of cattle, and so forth. And he always asks me, "Hey, do you want the bones? Do you want the kidney? Do you want the spleen? Do you want the tongue? Do you want the liver, the heart?" I'm like, "Yes, yes, yes. I want everything." So we try to get as much as possible. But in a big outfit like that, where does all that go?
So when we eat the beef ourselves, or when people buy a quarter, half, or whole from us, they get as much or as little as they want. We're old school. We've been, my grandpa sold quarter halves and wholes like 60 years ago. So you get an animal, it's literally yours. Take as much or as little as you want, and which people enjoy. The small butcher facilities, like your small family owned ones, some sell. I've had some small butchers that know restaurants or chefs, or there's people that reach out and try to grab those, which is great. The bigger harvesting facilities, one really cool thing, and I don't know if you've ever seen this graphic, it's like everything that your steer makes, which I find very interesting because they used to make insulin medicine from, I think it was, it's like enough medicine for so many people out of so many steers, for example, and then all the like textiles and makeup and medicine, and I mean the obvious stuff, your leather car seats and your footballs, and they really try to send that to certain places, which from the cattleman standpoint is kind of funny because they're only paying us for the animal, and then the big packing plants, they get this extra, for all the other places that they're sending the offal, if you will. A lot of them send some of those cuts overseas because other countries and cultures utilize more organ meat than we do, like tripe, right? I mean, you can't find that in the United States very easily. So they really do a good job of trying to utilize that. I wish that I could find a place that would take our hides and utilize some of that stuff, because it kills me to waste it. But the larger harvesting facilities, I'll give them credit. They do seem to do a pretty good job moving some of that.
Yeah. So what do you do with the hide? Does it compost? You put it in the trash? You
Our
bury it?
butcher, our butcher just takes it and composts it. They just have a facility that takes it and does it. I've looked into getting some hides and stuff made. It's just very expensive, and it's kind of a dying art. So unfortunately, it's something someday I'd like to do more. We've done a few that we have, but just the ease of getting it done isn't like what it used to be.
Yeah, I think that's an unfortunate thing. Everyone's looking for processes and systems and things like that. The hide with the pigs that we processed ourselves, we turned it into dog food, and so like every aspect of the pig was utilized and so forth. And just I think it's important for folks to understand. And at that place, there was a small local processor who's been doing this for a very very long time. There were some older hogs that were being processed from like a petting zoo, So I think this idea that animals are saved, from the horrors of animal husbandry, and then the local farm that had the petting zoo, well, they ended up processing the pig and then they converted that to dog food, right? So it goes back to what we are talking about. All animals will eventually die. And the idea here is we're trying to raise animals and give them the healthiest life and happiest life as possible. And as you mentioned, they had one bad day. And in the wild, they would have probably one bad day or a worse day, right? With, maybe you want to get into predators. I know there's in the state of Idaho in the late 90s, they reintroduced Canadian gray wolves around Yosemite and parts of Wyoming. And those wolves have now been reintroduced into Colorado. So have you had any wolf issues, or has it mostly been coyote issues out in Nebraska?
So, where we live, because we're in the more populated part of the state, so I'm eastern Nebraska. Western Nebraska is the sand hills. If you've ever heard of people talk about the sand hills of Nebraska, but we're more populated. We have coyotes. This hasn't happened for a while, but we had a pack of wild dogs do some damage, and coyotes around us, fortunately, we haven't had problems with them killing the calves. Now, granted, we're out there all the time. We've lost one or two to coyotes, but we kind of assume it's a stillbirth, as in the cow gave birth and the calf just didn't have any vigor to get going. But fortunately for us, we haven't had too many problems with them, but we also I have a Great Pyrenees who keeps coyotes away. Her dogs are very aggressive, and we try to make a line, if you will. You guys stay over here, we're on this side, and live in harmony to a certain extent. But from a predator problem, no wolves or anything, and it's more of the western part of the state that I feel like sometimes gets hit a little harder than we do.
Yeah. Do you hear about that from other ranchers in Colorado and in Montana and Wyoming?
I have a friend of mine who I met on social media, and she's in the county where they introduced wolves. She's a rancher. They have cattle and sheep, and not just five. They're very well established. And she posted right when they let the wolves out, within, I'm going to say, a month, there was a wolf footprint next to her dog's footprint in the snow. She's done some measures. I know that they have like blinking ear tags. So all ranchers, 95% of ranchers have ear tags with your cow's number, so you know who they are. And they have these ear tags that flash now. So they put them in all the calves at birth. I think they tag at birth. Once again, every rancher does it different. And then it flashed. So that was a deterrent for wolves, supposed to be. They're trying. I actually haven't checked in with her to see how things are going, but they're trying to keep them at bay over there.
Yeah, it's pretty wild and seemingly controversial too. I think a lot of people think, oh, wolves are great. They're like dogs. They have, families and social structures and things like that. But they definitely do a number from what I've been told with friends in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. And it's gotten so out of hand. The state of Idaho wanted to reintroduce these wolves, and they wanted to cap it at 300 wolves. And now there's close to 2,000. They're actually paying people to trap and hunt these wolves because they've been a problem, especially on the deer and elk populations and things like that. But I haven't spoken with a rancher, east of Colorado to see, what that effect has had. But very interesting stuff here. Now, what about other ruminants? Have you ever thought, and there's a big push for bison. People are excited about the taste of bison and maybe even elk and antelope and things like that. Have you ever thought about, or from the people that in your industry, what would be downsides? Are bison, from what have you ever thought about raising bison?
Bison, no. There's multiple reasons for that. I actually have a friend who raises bison, and her dad's been raising them forever. Bison are a whole nother animal. Just like raising hogs and raising sheep. I mean, it's a whole nother animal. Like literally, just because they're ruminants and look like beef, they're not. A lot of processors won't harvest them. You have to have a special harvester because bison jump fences. They're very tall. They're very athletic. Also the market for it, and it's, I ruminants are ruminants and they benefit the environment, so we just choose beef for that reason. It's what we've done. But if you're going to get bison, that's like a whole infrastructure change. It's not just you can get some and hope they don't run through the fence. Like even tame ones, they're just a different animal. So I don't think there's going to be a big explosion of them for those reasons I just said. Harvesting and infrastructure. I mean, the price of everything right now, even though a lot of people are getting excited about it, like you said, which is great. The more the merrier, teach their own. But cattlemen aren't just going to be able to flip a switch and switch over because of just the cost of doing that would be, I mean, if you have a substantial ranch, that's millions of dollars in investments and fencing and your processing facilities. You literally would have to start over to a certain extent.
Wow. And they're really heavy. They can jump fences, huh? They're pretty nimble.
Yeah, and I can't remember what my friend said, but I think they can jump like, I mean, I'm 6 feet tall, and I know that, when she has a harvester, that the panels that they put up for the bison are taller than that. Think of like a deer jumping, and then if you think about a deer and then bison, how they're athletic and how they're made, you can kind of see how they can just kind of jump over stuff more. So it's just like they're just a different animal. Like there's nothing wrong with them. And I know that there's some tame ones, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're all wild and crazy, but you would really have to take a step back and look at what you have to even be able to contain them.
Interesting. I want to talk more about the environment, but I just have a small story that I think if I don't share it now, I might forget it, Michaela.
Yeah.
So I was out deer hunting in a really remote area of Washington. And I'm talking, it was 7 miles in, and I'm on this ridge, and I hear a little bell. And I was seeing cow dung everywhere. I thought at first it might have been, the big piles, big patties. And I thought, there's no elk out. I know this area doesn't have elk. And there was one lonely cow. And it seems that it's like BLM land, government
Yep.
land, and they would run the cattle there in the summertime. And this was in October. But there was just one cow by itself. I don't know if it was a boy or girl, whatever. And that area gets a lot of snow in the winter, and so somehow it just got out or didn't make it on the truck or whatever.
Yeah.
What are the odds that that cow would have survived a pretty intense winter if it could have moved down towards the river bottoms and things like that, and it's by itself? I often wonder. I want to go back in the area and see if it's still around. Do you think that a cow like that could survive by itself through a winter in the mountains?
I'm not familiar with mountain areas and such very much. So I think that's kind of like a loaded question, like how, because Western Nebraska gets a lot of snow, but it melts. Like our snow stays. You see what I'm saying? So there's like all these different variabilities, which would be really interesting. But cattle are more resourceful than sometimes we give them credit for too. So if she's a smart gal, which there's some really smart ones, she could probably make it. A lot of times they'll wander, and especially if it's a cow. So if it's an older cow, not a young animal that, maybe it was their first time out on pasture and just isn't familiar with the area and where the water is and the shelter and those sorts of things. If it's an older animal, they can be pretty resourceful too. And a lot of times they'll just show up somewhere. We've had like a friend whose cattle got out and he's like, I can't find this one heifer. She'll show up somewhere, hopefully, eventually. A lot of times they'll just start navigating towards some other cattle or some other animals or some other water. So she could have made it if she was pretty old or so.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
are they pretty social? They like to be around each other for the most part?
Yeah, you can't, like we can't just take, and this is an age thing too, and the animal's temperament, but like an older animal would be okay in a pen, up by the home place because they've been around for years. They know, what's going on. But if you have younger animals, and you sort one off, their fight or flight kicks in. even if they're the calmest animal in the group, if you have 20 calves in a pen and you sort one off and put it in a pen by itself, that animal's demeanor can change in 30 seconds. It can be running the fence, can be sticking its head in the panels looking for a way to get out. That calf 5 minutes ago, I could have put my hand on its back and walked along, letting it know I was there, or like touching its back end so it knew, and could be as completely as calm as can be. But once you sort them off, that's when that fight or flight will kick in. So, if you want to keep a couple animals, you can't just, oh, I want a cow. You really shouldn't just get one, because they're not going to be their natural self and could be extremely stressed. So that, herd mentality, although there's a reason why people say that, but they really do need at least one friend. And sometimes that's not enough either. So
super interesting. People talk about how pigs have the intelligence of like a 4-year-old child. What would you say, or is there any related comparison with cattle?
not off the top of my head, but they're smart. Like our cows in May, they start going to all the gates and they stand there like, when are you turning us out to grass? When we load up our cows to take them to corn stalks, they walk on the trailer. Like we just open the gate and, walk behind them. Like they know what we're doing. When we move cows on corn stalks, we just call them with the 4-wheeler or the Ranger, or sometimes on foot if it's not too far. And they follow us because they know what we're doing. They know where we're going. They have one strand of hot wire is all that keeps our cows in. They respect it. Like they're smart, yes. But I don't know of a hog comparison, because that's like a different level of intelligence, in my opinion. I mean, we've all seen people like litter train, lack of a better word, like a potbelly pig. Like you can't do that with cows. So I'm not sure what the scale is, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And what's the benefit to the corn grower or related farmer, right? It seems like where I'm getting at, it seems that there's synergy here with animal husbandry. I think there's a big push to get 100% of the population away from animal-based foods, because the thinking is they're bad for the environment, and we should all be eating a healthier plant-based diet. But there's a lot of synergy here with the manure, and you mentioned the corn stalk. In that context, how does that benefit the corn grower?
So this is kind of dipping into like the regenerative and the sustainable side, which I always say most ranchers and farmers are doing to a certain extent. You may do more regenerative or sustainable practices than I do. Every rancher I'm thinking off the top of my head does this to a certain extent, just everybody's a little different. So there's a couple things that like we do, for example, is once harvest is over, we run our cows. So those are bred females that will calve in the spring. We run them on corn stalks. So what they're doing is consuming that plant material. They're fertilizing that field. They're also cleaning up some of the grain that's left over, not a lot, and just basically they are fertilizing that field while cleaning up some of that matter and actually breaking it down faster than just leaving it there for nature to do, as in I'm talking rain and sun and breaking down that plant material. And then we do cover crops, and also we do rotational grazing and taking the manure. So in the winter, our cows have windbreaks and we put bedding down for them to lay on when the weather's really cold. And then we take that and spread that on pastures or crop fields as well. So that just, it's like this circle that just benefits soil health and just naturally fertilizing and doing all these things and giving, we've increased yield of grass growing in certain parts of our pasture by making sure we put the same amount of manure on it for a couple of years in a row. And then it just is so much healthier. And it's not that we did it, it was water erosion and just like a side hill or something. So there's lots of benefits with that look how good that is for the environment, where people who want to just eat a plant-based diet, you're ripping up more of this land that our cattle could be grazing and leaving, and sequestering carbon and all these things we've all heard people talk about. You're kind of doing more damage to the environment than good by ripping up a natural pasture that these cattle are grazing and wildlife. I mean, we have coyotes, turkeys, raccoons, bobcats, that's badgers. I mean, that's just once again like out my window running around. And if that gets ripped up and turned into corn, there's not going to be much animals benefiting from that.
Right.
So,
But even if it was turned into corn, let's just play that argument out.
yep.
It doesn't mean that that wildlife is still not going to die or other animals aren't going to die. I think a lot of people don't realize how many hawks, how many wild hogs, how many, pharaohs, mice, ferrets. I mean, all these animals, to raise, even in the context of blueberries, we have a lot of blueberries, in
Yeah.
our backyard, and we waited 1 or 2 days. We were like, okay, they're almost ready to really go out there and spend a full day picking them. And then
Yeah.
we came out last night. It's really crazy, Michaela. And the birds and rabbits have just devoured the blueberries. So, if you eat a primarily, plant-based diet, there's a lot of other animals that want to eat that same food. And if you're a farmer, you're going to try to expire those animals or deter them in some way. And people don't want to hear this, but they're often shot, they're poisoned, they're trapped, all these things. So just because you eat a vegan diet doesn't mean that other animals are not dying to get that food to your table. Do you ever have conversations, having a social media profile, vegans sending you, messages about how horrible of a person you are or things like
Yeah.
that? I know there was a lady in LA who had a vegan restaurant for a while. I'm sure you've heard this story. I think her name is Susie. I could get that name wrong. But a lot of activists were picketing at a restaurant saying, how dare you serve animal regenerative meat, at your restaurant now? There's a lot of vitriol and hate towards ranchers and people who eat meat. What are your thoughts there?
And part of me thinks it's just because of this like mob mentality, like that people are so wanting to belong to something and feel like have a purpose. I'm not trying to be rude or crass, but like you have your village of people, right? With what you do and your village of people who are spreading good and talking about science and helping people get healthier. And I feel like a lot of times this is just like people fall into this like we're ruining the earth and animals, need to live forever. Nobody needs to eat them. And then they just keep doubling down on that without taking a step back and really looking at like all the vegan vegetarian options that they're consuming, not only how much detrimental to the environment and potentially to themselves if they're not doing it right, but also just, I mean, I don't care if someone's a vegan or a vegetarian, but you don't need to tear somebody else down because of that. And my other thing too, it really bothers me is if they think it's because it's inhumane, bad for the environment. In the healthy thing, I think people have kind of stepped away from saying like, and I'm giving credit to you and Doc Jamie and Sean Baker, and I think people are finally like, oh, it's okay to eat meat, and I think people are just doubling down now on it's inhumane and we're ruining the environment, which really bothers me because so many people buy fast fashion, throw shirts away all the time, are going out to eat all the time, getting your single-use plastics and the damage they're doing to the environment than what we're doing. I would bet the ranch that it's 10 times worse than what we're doing. And that's where it bothers me when it's my fault, not their lifestyle and choices.
It's a really good point. If we play that argument out further and think about eating seasonally, Michaela, what are people in Nebraska, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, what are they eating or what if, I mean, let's just be realistic. There's no fruits that are growing between October and May, or really vegetables, unless they're grown under plastic in most of the US. So if you're eating a plant-based diet and you're doing everything right, most of that food is being imported from other parts of the world, like Latin America, like Asia, wherever. And how economically friendly is that? And so I think that's my follow-up question there to you is,
Yeah.
what does your diet look like in the winter months when it's cold? There's nothing, there's, no, obviously no corn, no wheat, no fruit. Are you having bone broth, steaks? What does a ranching family eat during the cold winter months?
So we're big fans of frozen berries, frozen vegetables. I've got a 8-year-old and a 6-year-old who eat just as much red meat as I do and get mad if their steak's not red enough. I've created little monsters now. But, when people talk about like steak and potatoes, so That's what I grew up on. Meat, red meat. I calculated the other day, our family of four, we eat probably 2 pounds of red meat a day. That's 765 pounds of red meat a year. And I'd argue that's cooked meat. And if I really would take a step back and look at roasts, with some bone and some fat in there, it's probably more raw meat we're cooking. I try to be seasonal. Like you just said, I'm buying watermelon from the local vegetable and fruit growers in our area, and I know them. They're growing it themselves. And then in the winter months, we do a lot of roasts with a lot of crock pots, a lot of ground beef. Meat is always at the forefront at our house. And then I always just try to backfill with fruit and veggies, whatever's in season, like you said. And that's just kind of how we work, because even if I go to the grocery store and buy some fruit or vegetables that's, like you said, shipped in from somewhere, I know it does have the nutritional quality that we need, because you can taste the difference. And I feel like sometimes we forget that a tomato in late July is a heck of a lot better than a tomato in January, no matter where it's coming from. We do have some awesome greenhouses in the middle of our state. So if I see that they have some tomatoes at like our local grocery store, I'll get some then, supporting someone local. But I feel like, the old ways we're used to, at least I was used to, soups, stews, not only because it's economical and healthy, but also we're cold in the winter and we want hot food that if it's been a late night or a long day, I know I can heat up something quick and easy. And a lot of times we're even eating that stuff for breakfast because it's just brutal in the winter. So
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think this is an aspect of food that the conversation often gets lost, and we think about what's healthy versus what's not healthy, and just going back to the seasonality aspect of it, and what foods are available within a 50 to 100-mile radius of you at any given time, and that's probably what you should be consuming, throughout the different season. And if you
yep.
do that, you will likely be healthy. I was just in France actually a few weeks ago, and we went to a classic French restaurant in the Alps and so on. And it was really unique in that, some of the foods there, like fondue and these different cheese type dishes, were really popular in the winter when it's very, very cold. This really energetically dense meal, like you just mentioned, would keep you warm and satiated in the winter. There's not, berry smoothies or kale smoothies, right? Because that wouldn't grow in that area. So I think, this push towards a more slow and local food movement is now a global phenomenon. But again, the push by the activists and the powers that be is just have plants all the time, no matter what. If it's imported, there was that picture Brian Sanders shared that of pears that are grown in Latin
Yeah.
America, processed in Thailand and consumed in the US. And so when people say, "Oh, you eat meat, it's so bad for the environment," you're like, there are so many so-called healthy plant-based foods that are grown in a completely different part of the world, packaged somewhere else, and then presented on this silver platter here in America or North America or wherever it is. And people feel so morally good about consuming that, but that will quickly, activists, you see them, and I have not seen an omnivore go to a grocery store and throw the broccoli on the ground, but there's so many viral videos of people pouring milk out and throwing eggs and taking the chicken off the shelf. And it's like, why do people do that? I don't understand. It's like there's a lack of understanding here about where food really comes from, and the real science to it, and the aspect of eating locally grown food and the seasonality part of it.
And I feel like too that there's something that a lot of people don't understand. They get upset when they see chicken housed in sheds. And most people, even the people probably raising them, would prefer to raise them a different way. And I'm not saying that they're doing anything bad, wrong, mishandling, inhumane. But I feel like this all or nothing mentality with how our animals are being raised, when we need to take a step back and look what's happened from 2011 to 2018, we have lost 100,000 farmers and ranchers. 100,000 in 7 years. And from 2017 to 2018, I think we lost 12,000 of them, like to put that into perspective. So there's these huge shifts that are happening in agriculture right now too. 70% of the US farmland is supposed to change hands in the next 20 years because all of these small farms and ranches, for example, my dad is 63 years old. If they don't have someone to come back and take care of this land, these animals, who do you think's going to buy it? It's not going to, we can't even compete with land prices in our area right now because they're astronomical. Bill Gates is one of the largest landowners in the state of Nebraska. I think right now, he probably owns more now. He owns like 250,000 acres in the United States. There's this huge shift happening with the small farms and ranchers. When I'm saying small farms and ranches, they're not 20 cows. They can be hundreds of cows. They can be maybe, 500 acres of crops. That's really not that small, but they're small in comparison. We're getting choked out. And so instead of these animal rights activists, for lack of a better word, going to the grocery store and throwing meat and throwing a fit basically in regards to the meat and produce in the area, if they don't agree with it, we should just be trying to support anything grown in the United States right now. Because even though you buy ground beef and, your potatoes at your local grocery store, it's okay because you're still supporting someone like us, because that still sets the market for that potato farmer and that cattleman. I always tell people to try to find a USA label on it. And then that's okay. If you can't buy from someone local, just see if you can find, support a company in the United States. It's okay. But these people who are throwing a fit and then they're going to Starbucks and getting a smoothie and they have no idea where any of that came from, you are literally contradicting everything you're saying right now. And I feel like we need to take a step back and just support everything American-based we can, because we're going to be in trouble if we don't wake up a little bit and start supporting local, and especially in the next 20 years, because it's not going to be good if we lose more farms and ranches, which is looking like it is unless we have a big change here soon.
And so let's play that out. And I have two questions here. What happened to that 100,000 loss of cattlemen? Were they acquired by the bigger guy who's grown something else there? And then, what does our food system look like if that is owned by someone who has an agenda like Bill Gates? What does that look like? Are they just growing corn in place of that, or sitting on the land? How do you see the future look?
So the 100,000 farms and ranches that were lost, that could be, that would be you. You said you have some hogs, right? So say you had 5-10 hogs, you're in that group of farms and ranches now. If you, on your census or in the, National Pork Association, if you register as a pork producer and then you sold out, you would be in that group. So it's not necessarily the big guys. Think of it like your grandparents, like that group. And I'm not calling them backyard farmers either. I'm talking 50 years ago where somebody had 20 cows and 20 hogs, and that's all in that group. A lot of those farms and ranches, we've lost 31 million acres of ag land since 1982. So a lot of that's now your urban sprawl. They either, I don't want to say sold out, but they sold out. I hate to say it. I'm not bagging on the farmer or rancher because, I don't know if you've heard about farming in 1980. You were paying more in interest than you were paying on your land payment. Like, it's just what farms and ranches go through. Sometimes sometimes I'm surprised there's still this many of us around, to be honest. So urban sprawl. Some farms and ranches maybe just condensed a little bit. Maybe say you had 3 uncles farming, 2 sold out, and now 1 just farms. That happens sometimes too. Or urban sprawl, or the neighbor buys it. That's my understanding of what has happened. I don't know out of those 100,000 farms what the split was of loss to urban sprawl versus just another farm or ranch bought it. So still concerning. But I feel like, like Bill Gates, I have a couple friends I've met online, like they go, so-and-so sold their farmland. They didn't know Bill Gates bought it until it was sold, because they're doing these, what's the word? So they're buying it backdoor is the way to say that, I guess. And buying ag land has kind of become the rich man's game. And I'm not bagging on, doctors and lawyers and people who are very well established, have businesses. kind of the Yellowstone effect. Which I love the Yellowstone TV show, like they did. I know it was a drama, but they gave a nod to the rancher in a great way that hadn't been done for a while. Well, now everybody wants to be a rancher, and they're driving up land prices, and the people who actually need it can't compete. We're getting choked out. And I'm talking myself. I know farms and ranches around us, there's land comes up for sale, and we can't, it doesn't pencil out. So somebody swoops in and buys it, and that's just how it is. And I'm not trying to be like, oh, woe is me by any means, but I'm being honest and realistic that you just can't compete. You could get a loan out for it, but I don't know when you would start making money back on it. Like, no smart accountant or banker is going to say this is a good idea. Like, it just doesn't pencil out anymore. And then these people are buying it, and it's just making it harder to maintain or grow, even if you want to grow a little bit. So
Yeah, it's really sad. I look at ranch land all the time on the internet, and there's different websites for just land, and the prices are insane, especially in the western states. I don't know about Nebraska, but I'm sure it's relatively similar. You know, if you look at Colorado, you look at Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, Washington. Yeah, you have to have had made a lot of money elsewhere, and then want to get into this for the right reasons, or potentially the wrong reasons, to be able to afford that. We're talking, you know, I don't know, $700 an acre or more in certain areas, 700,000 an acre. You know, it gets really, really, really expensive very, very fast, even for land out in the middle of nowhere.
yeah.
So it's pretty crazy. Michaela, along those lines, there's a lot of talk about this new bird flu that is affecting cattle, and people speculate, immunologists and so forth, that if it jumps from cattle to pigs and hogs and porcine, then it can make its way to humans. How concerned are you about this new avian flu, and have you been affected by it?
Not. It's they're trying to make it into something it's not. Now, I am talking at it from a cattle producer standpoint and person standpoint. I know that, you know, avian flu can be a problem with poultry. We've seen the sick birds, and you've seen them. I'm not going to talk about the poultry side. I'm just going to talk about cattle production in us. And everything I've read is the cattle basically act like they get a cold if they have it. It was a couple dairies, they say milk production's gone down a little bit, but nothing's dying. You know, it's no different than, you could be the healthiest rancher in the world with your herd, and every now and then you get something that runs through it. I mean, it just happens. That's my understanding of what is going on. I actually spoke with someone, I have a friend in the animal medical side, and it sounds like they think that it was passing from the people who were milking that were not using the best sanitary conditions. They weren't following the correct SOPs, and the cows were getting infected through their udder. So what I've heard started in humans, kind of got in the cattle, but not really, because of human error, and production went down a little bit because it's only been dairy. If you talk to any cattle rancher, we're not really concerned about it.
Yeah. I don't know that anyone is really concerned about it, but it sounds to me a little bit like monkeypox. If you remember in 2021, how this is going to be the next COVID. Oh my gosh, we got to have our eyes on a monkeypox vaccine. And it affected a couple of you know, people who were participating in weird drug use and anal sex or something like that. So not really a big deal. Yeah, the media, it seems now, when it comes to new pathogens, there's our level of risk is really low for a lot of people. They think everything is going to make you sick, and you have to stay inside and wash your hands and all this stuff. So I don't know. Interesting to hear your perspective on it, Michaela. And of course, all the insights that you shared today will help a lot of people. So you said Eastern Nebraska?
Yes.
And you do quarters, halves, wholes, and so forth for people. And can folks buy? If I recall, there's something unique about the steer that you offer. Can you speak to that as we finish up?
So when we sell our beef, so all of our cattle are registered Red Angus and Angus, and everything that we raise is from birth to butcher. That's a little common, but actually, if you look at ranching as a whole, most ranchers don't finish out their own cattle. So we're unique in that way. Like I said, all of our cattle are registered, so we really have a lot of data behind it, and they're all finished at our place. We literally are taking care of them the entire way. from birth to butcher. And I always tell people, I can tell you your steak's great grandpa's birth weight. That's how much data we keep. So I know that our steaks are great. We have so much data on how our cattle perform and their health and their ability to perform and provide the best beef possible. Yes, we do ship nationwide as well. Yep. And then I also try to share, which is what I always appreciate everything you share. And I really just try to share just general information about ranching in general. And I try to help people understand, some of the terms that ranchers are using. So if you want to find a local rancher and have questions, I really try to use my platform as a way just to help others out. If you're looking for a rancher in your state, what these differences really mean and just to get you pointed in the right direction. I don't care if it's grass or grain. I just want people eating beef. So that's my job at the end of the day.
Amazing. So I'll put D&D Beef, which is your dndbeef.com, which is your website. I'll put it in the show notes in the description below. Do you have any coupon codes, or if someone is curious, they live in the Midwest or Colorado and they want to try your beef, do you have different packages, or is it just quarter, whole, half?
We do everything. You can buy a 1 pound of ground beef to quarter of a beef share. We can ship it to you. So we've really grown the past few years. We're getting in more beef in the next week or two. So maybe by the time this airs, I'll have restocked our website. But we ship and have it all. We also have organ meats as well if people are interested. We do marrow bones, like I said, liver to ground beef, oxtail. I try to have it all for everybody to consume. So if you're looking for something specific, we might be able to help you out too. So
awesome. Michaela, thanks so much for coming on and
Thank you.
sharing your wisdom. It was a great conversation, and I really appreciated all the candid aspects of the industry and agriculture and farming in general. So
Thanks
thank
for
you.
having me. Thank
Yeah.
you.